At 5:29 p.m., a photograph is taken. The image is clear. Well lit. Nothing appears unusual. A man stands in a bathroom, relaxed, unguarded. Minutes later, another image is captured. This one is different. Blurred. Unstable. Unintentional. Investigators would later isolate that frame. Because between those two images, something happened that no one was supposed to see. This case centers on Mesa, Arizona. In June 2008, Travis Alexander is found deceased inside his home. The primary person of interest is Jodi Arias. What initially stands out isn't just the crime. It's the timeline. Because before the violence, there was a pattern. And that pattern had been forming long before June 4th. Before June 2008, nothing about their relationship appeared outwardly criminal. They met in 2006 at a business conference. Fast connection. Shared ambition. Immediate chemistry. But even early on, subtle imbalances began to form. Arias converted to Alexander's faith shortly after meeting him. Investigators would later revisit this decision, not as commitment, but as adaptation. A shift in identity to maintain proximity. At first, the relationship followed a predictable pattern. Intense communication. Long-distance travel. Private intimacy combined with public distance. The relationship between Alexander and Arias did not follow a straight line. It cycled. They separated, then reconnected, then distanced again, then returned. Over time, those cycles became shorter. More frequent. Less stable. On its own, that might not seem unusual. Relationships end and restart all the time. But repetition changes the structure. It creates unpredictability. And unpredictability begins to influence behavior in ways that are not immediately obvious. When investigators later reviewed communication records, they weren't searching for conflict. They were looking for pattern. And what they found was not escalation in aggression, but escalation in persistence. Across months of communication, certain details began to align. Messages increased after periods of silence. Tone shifted depending on response. Conversations restarted after they had already ended. Individually, these moments appear ordinary. But placed together, inside a timeline, they begin to show something else. An inability to maintain separation. Investigators would later realize that detail mattered. Another pattern begins to surface in the way communication is handled. There is a noticeable adaptability. When the connection appears strong, the tone is warm. When distance begins to form, communication becomes more persistent. When responses change, the approach adjusts. This is not inherently unusual behavior. But its consistency becomes significant. Because it suggests an ongoing effort, not just to communicate, but to maintain influence over the relationship itself. This case is not defined by a single moment. It is shaped by continuity. And continuity reveals direction long before action. At this stage, investigators are not solving a crime yet. They are reconstructing context. They begin by mapping communication, phone records, emails, digital exchanges, not only for what is said, but for when it is said. Timing becomes critical. Contact continues after emotional closure points. Response gaps trigger renewed outreach. Silence is not accepted as final. A message sent immediately after no response carries different meaning than one sent days later. And in this case, messages tend to follow quickly. Repeatedly. That consistency becomes the focus. When early communication patterns are compared to later ones, they align. The same persistence appears over time. This suggests intention rather than reaction. The behavior is not temporary. It is stable. By early 2008, one shift becomes increasingly clear. The relationship is no longer balanced. One person begins moving forward. The other continues engagement. That imbalance introduces tension. Because when one side disengages and the other continues, the dynamic changes. It is no longer mutual. It becomes directional. There is no single argument that defines this moment. No visible breaking point. Instead, there is a gradual shift that becomes noticeable only in hindsight. Communication becomes less reciprocal. But it does not stop. That detail is critical. Because persistence in the absence of reciprocation is not neutral. It creates pressure. And pressure begins to shape behavior. The case is no longer about connection. It becomes about continuation. Maintaining access. Maintaining presence. Maintaining influence. At this point, nothing criminal has occurred. But patterns are forming. Repeated attempts to re-engage after distance suggest difficulty accepting separation. Adaptive communication suggests awareness of how to maintain interaction. Continued contact ensures the connection never fully dissolves. These are not conclusions. They are observations. And they matter because behavior does not begin at the moment of a crime. It begins long before, in patterns that appear ordinary until they are placed in sequence. Later, in the courtroom, these early patterns would be revisited. Not as proof of guilt, but as context. Because understanding behavior before an event helps explain behavior during it. At this stage in the timeline, there is no violence. No crime. Only a pattern. But patterns create direction. And direction determines outcome. When someone continues reaching out after every sign of distance, the question becomes, is that persistence, or something else? Because in the next phase, that pattern does not stop. It intensifies. Messages become more frequent. Responses become less consistent. And the gap between connection and rejection gets smaller. Until eventually, it disappears completely. At 2:48 a.m., another message is sent. There is no immediate response. Minutes pass. Then another message follows. And then another. By morning, the conversation exists, but only on one side. What begins to change here is not volume. It's direction. By early 2008, the dynamic between Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias is no longer balanced. Contact still exists. But it no longer flows evenly. One side begins to reduce engagement, shorter replies, delayed responses, longer gaps between interactions. The other side compensates. Messages become more frequent. More strategically timed. More adaptive in tone. This is where investigators later focus their attention, not on what is said, but on how communication adjusts to maintain connection. When response delays increase, outreach becomes faster. When tone shifts, tone is mirrored. When engagement drops, effort increases. Individually, these responses can appear attentive. But in sequence, they form something more structured. A pattern of compensation. And compensation suggests imbalance. Phone records and digital logs show repeated reinitiation of conversations that had already ended. Not abruptly. Not aggressively. But consistently. A message is sent. No reply. Another follows. Then another, often reframed, lighter tone, different angle, adjusted entry point. The objective is not confrontation. It is continuation. That distinction becomes critical. Because continuation does not require agreement. It only requires access. At this stage, there is no clear conflict visible in the communication itself. But there is a shift in emotional positioning. Language begins to adjust depending on perceived distance. Warmth increases when connection appears uncertain. Reassurance appears without being requested. Moments that once ended naturally now extend. Investigators later identify this as a transition point. Not because anything dramatic happens, but because the function of communication changes. It is no longer just interaction. It becomes maintenance. Across weeks, this maintenance becomes more deliberate. Timing begins to matter. Messages appear at moments when response likelihood is highest, early mornings, late evenings, transitional points in routine. When those attempts fail, follow-ups appear quickly. Not days later. Not hours later. but within a short window. That window becomes a measurable pattern. And patterns can be tracked. When mapped over time, the data shows a narrowing gap between silence and re-engagement. Silence is no longer allowed to exist. It is filled. Immediately. Repeatedly. This is where investigators begin to see something else emerge. Sensitivity to loss of control. Not control in a direct sense, but control over connection itself. When communication is mutual, no adjustment is necessary. When it becomes uneven, behavior adapts to correct it. That correction becomes visible here. Meanwhile, external movement begins to shift. Travis Alexander begins focusing on other areas of life: travel, social interaction, new connections. Nothing abrupt. Nothing confrontational. Just gradual movement forward. But forward movement in one direction creates distance in the other. And distance, when not accepted, leads to pursuit. The communication reflects that pursuit. There are no explicit demands. No overt pressure. Instead, there is persistence wrapped in normalcy. Messages that appear casual, open-ended, non-confrontational, but consistent. That consistency is what stands out. Because it does not decrease over time. It increases. Investigators later compare early-stage communication to this period. The difference is not just quantity. It is intent. Earlier interactions show exchange. Now, they show initiation without response. Maintenance without reinforcement. This is no longer a shared interaction. It becomes one-sided continuity. At this point, nothing illegal has occurred. But the structure of behavior has changed. And structure determines trajectory. Another detail begins to surface in the communication pattern. Reframing. When a message goes unanswered, the next message often shifts tone or context. A previous topic is dropped. A new one is introduced. The goal is not resolution. It is re-entry. Maintaining access without directly addressing the absence. This avoids confrontation. But it also avoids closure. And without closure, the interaction remains open. That openness allows continuation. Even when engagement is minimal. From an investigative standpoint, this becomes significant later. Because it demonstrates adaptability. Not in a reactive sense. But in a sustained, strategic way. The communication does not stop when it fails. It changes form. That ability to adjust becomes a key behavioral marker. And it will appear again under very different circumstances. By mid-2008, the gap between the two individuals is no longer just emotional. It is directional. One is moving forward. The other is maintaining position. But maintaining position requires effort. And effort, when repeated without return, builds pressure. Not externally. Internally. Because the outcome is no longer dependent on mutual interaction. It becomes dependent on persistence alone. At this stage, investigators would later note that no single message stands out. No single exchange defines the shift. It is the accumulation. The repetition. The refusal to allow the connection to fully dissolve. That accumulation is what transforms behavior from ordinary to significant. And it leads to a critical question. What happens when persistence no longer produces the same result? Because the next phase is not about communication. It's about action, movement, planning, and decisions that no longer depend on response, but on control of the situation itself. A receipt is printed. The total is small. The item is ordinary. But the timing is precise. Days before June 4th, a series of quiet decisions begins to take shape. None of them draw attention on their own. But together, they form a sequence. And sequence is where investigators later focus. A rental vehicle is secured. Not unusual by itself. But it creates distance between the driver and their identity. Unlike a personal car, it limits immediate traceability. That matters, but only when placed alongside what follows. Shortly after, fuel is purchased. Not once. More than once. Stored, not immediately used. Containers filled and kept. This introduces something different. Because fuel, when carried separately, removes the need for stops. And stops create records. Receipts. Cameras. Locations. Removing stops reduces visibility. That distinction becomes critical later. Travel begins. But not directly. The route does not follow the most efficient path. Instead, it adjusts. Segments of the journey appear intentional, but not optimized. Investigators would later map this movement carefully. Because when travel deviates from efficiency, it often serves another purpose. And here, that purpose begins to emerge. Phone activity during this period remains controlled. No sudden spikes. No abrupt silence. Just continuity. Messages are sent. Calls occur. Nothing appears out of pattern. And that's exactly what makes it significant. Because the external signal remains stable, while logistical behavior shifts underneath. This separation, between what is visible and what is being arranged, creates a layered timeline. On the surface, nothing changes. Beneath it, preparation continues. One detail begins to stand out. Fuel usage does not align with expected travel needs. There is more fuel available than required for a direct trip. Which suggests something else. An intention to avoid interaction points along the way. Gas stations are not just service locations. They are data points. Time-stamped. Recorded. Eliminating them reduces traceable movement. This is not about speed. It is about control. Investigators later reconstruct the route using multiple data sources. Not just one. Rental agreements. Fuel estimates. Cellular activity. Each system provides a partial view. But when aligned, they reveal structure. And that structure does not reflect randomness. It reflects planning. Another factor emerges during this phase, timing. The travel window is narrow. Movement is coordinated within a specific time frame. Not rushed. But precise. Arrival is not incidental. It is positioned. And positioning matters. Because timing determines opportunity. The closer investigators examine this sequence, the clearer one pattern becomes. Nothing in this phase depends on chance. Each step reduces uncertainty. Each decision limits exposure. Each action supports the next. This is how premeditation appears in real cases. Not as a single moment, but as a chain of small, controlled choices. None of them dramatic. All of them intentional. One more detail begins to surface. There is no indication of hesitation. No reversal. No interruption in movement. Once the sequence begins, it continues. Without deviation. That continuity becomes important. Because hesitation often leaves gaps. And gaps create alternative explanations. Here, there are none. Everything aligns forward. At this point in the timeline, nothing has occurred inside the house yet. No confrontation. No visible conflict. Only preparation. And preparation, when complete, transitions into execution. But even within this controlled sequence, there is a limitation. One variable remains unaccounted for. Not in the planning. Not in the movement. But already present at the destination. A device. Inactive at first. Unnoticed. But capable of recording. Because in the next phase, the environment changes. And control, no matter how carefully constructed, meets something it cannot adjust. A moment that unfolds faster than planning can manage. And once that moment begins, it creates something permanent. At 5:20 p.m., the camera activates again. This time, it is deliberate. A series of images begins, clear, centered, controlled. The subject is inside the home. Positioned. Aware of the camera. Nothing appears out of place. The environment is contained. Predictable. But within minutes, that stability begins to shift. The sequence continues. Another image. Then another. Subtle changes in positioning. Movement within the frame. Still controlled. Still intentional. And then, the pattern breaks. A photograph appears that was never meant to exist. The framing is off. The angle unstable. The subject no longer composed. This is not a captured moment. It is an interrupted one. Investigators would later isolate this frame carefully, because it marks the exact point where control is lost. From that moment forward, the sequence changes completely. There are no more posed images. Only fragments. Disruption replaces structure. Inside the house, something shifts rapidly. There is no sign of forced entry. No indication of an external presence. Which means the change originates from within. And it happens fast. Faster than planning accounts for. Faster than adjustment allows. Forensic analysis later reveals that movement within the space is no longer controlled. It becomes reactive. Confined areas show signs of rapid repositioning. Not gradual. Not measured. But immediate. This is where the timeline compresses. What had been structured minutes earlier now unfolds in a narrow window. Investigators reconstruct this phase using three primary sources. Image sequence. Physical evidence. Spatial mapping. Each provides a different perspective. But together, they form a continuous progression. The first phase is proximity. No visible resistance. No indication of anticipation. Which suggests the moment begins without warning. Then comes escalation. Evidence indicates multiple actions occurring in quick succession. Not a single event, but a series. Each one building on the last. This is important, because it contradicts any explanation of a brief or isolated incident. The sequence shows duration. Not in hours, but in sustained moments. Movement patterns within the room confirm this. Positions change. Locations shift. The event does not remain fixed in one place. It travels. That movement becomes part of the reconstruction. Because movement leaves trace. And trace defines sequence. Another layer emerges in the forensic analysis. Different types of force are identified. Not uniform. Not singular. Which indicates something critical. Escalation. When one method does not end the event, another follows. This progression is not random. It reflects increasing intensity over time. Investigators pay close attention to order. Not just what occurred, but when. Because sequence determines intent. And intent shapes interpretation. The final phase of the event shows a change in positioning. The subject is no longer standing. No longer mobile in the same way. The environment reflects that shift. Everything indicates that the sequence has reached its endpoint. But what matters most is not just the conclusion. It's how it got there. Because the timeline shows something very specific. There was time between actions. Time to stop. Time to disengage. But the sequence continues. That continuity becomes one of the most important elements in the entire case. Because it challenges any explanation that depends on immediacy. The camera, unintentionally, documents the transition. Not in full detail, but enough to establish order. Before, during, after disruption. And once that sequence exists, it cannot be undone. Even attempts to remove it later do not eliminate it. Because deletion does not erase data. It only hides it. And hidden data can be recovered. That becomes critical later. Because while everything inside the house changes rapidly, what happens next is the opposite. The pace slows. Movement becomes controlled again. The sequence ends. But the timeline continues. And now, the focus shifts away from what happened inside the house to what happens immediately after leaving it. Because the next phase is not defined by chaos. It is defined by calm. A return to routine. A continuation of movement. As if nothing had occurred. And that contrast between what just happened and what comes next becomes one of the most important contradictions in the entire case. The first indication that something is wrong doesn't come from the scene. It comes from absence. Calls go unanswered. Messages remain unopened. Plans are missed without explanation. At first, it doesn't trigger urgency. Just concern. Because silence, on its own, can be explained. But when it extends beyond what is typical, it becomes noticeable. Days pass. That's when people begin to act. They go to the house. They expect a simple explanation. A missed call. A delay. Instead, they find something else entirely. Law enforcement is contacted. The investigation officially begins. But by that point, the timeline has already moved forward. Away from the house. Away from the scene. And into something far more difficult to interpret. Because immediately after the event, behavior does not reflect disruption. It reflects continuation. Inside the house, there are indications of attempted cleanup. Not complete removal. Not systematic. But selective. Certain areas show attention. Others remain unchanged. This creates an uneven environment. And uneven environments are revealing. Because they show intention, but also limitation. If someone fully controls a scene, the result is consistent. If they don't, patterns emerge. Here, patterns remain. Which means the effort was incomplete. But more importantly, it means the timeline continues without full resolution. After leaving the house, movement resumes. Not randomly. Not urgently. But in alignment with prior plans. Travel continues across state lines. The destination is not chosen after the event. It was already set. And that detail matters. Because it removes spontaneity from the equation. It shows that the next phase was already in motion. During this time, behavior remains stable. Interactions occur. Conversations take place. There are no visible signs of disruption. No deviation from expected activity. This creates a contrast that investigators later examine closely. Because when an event introduces significant change, behavior usually reflects it. But here, it doesn't. Instead, there is consistency. Routine. Normalcy. That normalcy becomes part of the investigation. Because it raises a question. Is behavior reflecting reality? Or masking it? Photographs taken during this period reinforce that question. They show continuity. Presence. Engagement. Nothing that directly connects to what occurred earlier. And that separation becomes significant. Because it creates two parallel timelines. One defined by what happened inside the house. The other defined by everything that followed. The challenge for investigators is connecting them. At this stage, those timelines do not yet intersect. But they will. Because while movement continues elsewhere, the scene remains untouched, unresolved, waiting to be discovered. When it is finally examined, investigators begin reconstructing what happened. Not through statements, but through evidence. And as that reconstruction begins, something becomes clear. What occurred inside the house does not align with the behavior that followed. That misalignment becomes critical. Because consistency between event and behavior strengthens explanation. Inconsistency weakens it. Here, the gap is significant. And gaps create questions. As the investigation expands, attention turns toward individuals connected to the victim. Interviews begin. Timelines are compared. Movements are analyzed. And slowly, the two separate timelines begin moving toward each other. Not through assumption, but through data. Because data does not rely on perception. It relies on record. Phone activity. Travel logs. Digital traces. Each piece adds structure. Each one reduces uncertainty. And as that structure forms, one thing becomes unavoidable. At some point, the timeline of movement will intersect with the timeline of the event. And when it does, it will require explanation. That explanation does not come immediately. Instead, it changes. More than once. Because when questioning begins, the first response is not admission. It is distance. From the event. From the location. From the timeline itself. But distance is difficult to maintain when evidence closes the gap. And once that gap begins to close, the narrative starts to shift. Because in the next phase, the focus is no longer on movement or behavior. It is on words. Statements given under pressure. Versions of events that evolve over time. And a sequence of explanations that don't just differ. They replace each other. The room is quiet. A recorder is placed on the table. A question is asked. The answer comes quickly. Clear. Direct. Certain. It establishes distance, no presence, no involvement, no connection to the moment in question. For a brief time, that version holds. But not for long. Because outside that room, the investigation has already moved forward. Digital recovery begins. Files that were assumed to be gone are restored. Fragments reappear. Then sequence. Then timestamps. What emerges is not a single piece of evidence. It is alignment. A reconstructed chain that connects location, time, and presence without relying on memory. And once that chain exists, it cannot be negotiated. The initial version is tested against it. It does not hold. So it changes. A second explanation is introduced. This time, it acknowledges proximity, but redirects responsibility. An unknown presence is inserted into the narrative. An external cause. A disruption from outside the known sequence. At first, it creates complexity. But complexity requires support. Investigators look for it. There is none. No additional entry points. No corresponding traces. No independent indicators that align with this new version. So the explanation begins to fracture. Not immediately. But under repetition. Because repetition is how investigators apply pressure. The same question returns in different forms. The same moment is approached from different angles. And each time, the answer adjusts slightly. Those adjustments are recorded. Compared. Layered. And slowly, a pattern appears. The details don't reinforce each other. They drift. That drift becomes measurable. And once it becomes measurable, it becomes evidence. A third version emerges. This one shifts again. Now the narrative no longer denies or deflects. It reframes. The event is no longer external. It is internal, but reactive. Positioned as a response to perceived threat. An attempt to explain not just what happened, but why it happened. But explanation introduces a new problem. It must align with sequence. And sequence has already been established. The reconstructed timeline does not depend on interpretation. It is anchored in recovered images, spatial movement, biological trace. Each of these systems operates independently. But they converge on the same structure. When the new explanation is placed inside that structure, it does not fit. The timing conflicts. The order breaks. The continuity disappears. And once again, the narrative becomes unstable. At this stage, investigators shift focus. They are no longer asking which version is correct. They are examining why the versions keep changing. Because stable memory does not require replacement. It requires consistency. Here, consistency is absent. What replaces it is adaptation. Each explanation attempts to solve a problem created by the previous one. But each solution introduces a new conflict. That cycle continues until the narrative can no longer stabilize. And at that point, the investigation reaches its critical phase. Everything is brought together. Digital reconstruction. Forensic analysis. Movement patterns. Behavior after the event. Interrogation responses. Individually, each piece has limitations. Together, they form a closed system. A structure where every element must align. If one part fails, the system adjusts. But here, the system does not adjust. It holds. And everything else must be measured against it. When the case moves into court, that structure becomes central. Not because it tells a story, but because it removes the need for one. Evidence is presented in sequence. Images restored from deletion. Movement mapped across time. Biological traces placed within space. Each piece reinforces the next. And as this happens, the earlier explanations are reintroduced. Not argued. Simply compared. Side by side. Against fixed points that do not change. That comparison becomes the turning point. Because once a narrative is placed next to unchanging evidence, any instability becomes visible. Not through accusation, but through contrast. The final phase is not about discovery. It is about decision. In May 2013, the jury delivers its decision. Guilty of first-degree murder. With this verdict followed a sentencing hearings which went through several sets of mistrial owing to the fact the jury could not reach a unanimous decision. But after several judicial deadlock on capital punishment. In 2015, the court delivers the final sentence. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A conclusion formed not from a single moment, but from alignment across every moment. And when that conclusion is reached, it carries weight beyond the case itself. Because what this investigation ultimately reveals is not just what happened. It reveals how truth behaves under pressure. It does not adapt. It does not shift. It does not require reconstruction. It remains consistent. Even when everything around it changes. And that raises a deeper question. When every version of a story must be adjusted to survive, while the evidence remains exactly the same, which one are we actually looking at? And more importantly, how often does the truth reveal itself not through what is said, but through what cannot stay consistent over time?